Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. And, today we are taking on a topic that's really captured my imagination, the idea of a lost civilization. And not just any lost civilization, one that may even predate those we usually learn about in history class. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's a question that's always fascinated historians and archaeologists alike, right? Like, what came before the civilizations we know so well? Could there be hidden chapters in our history just waiting to be uncovered?
Exactly, and that's what we're going to dig into today, exploring this possibility using some really interesting sources that connect the descendants of Noah's sons.
Yeah.
From the Bible to real historical civilizations, using all sorts of evidence like linguistics, archaeology, even mythology. It's going to be quite the journey.
We tend to think of history as this linear progression from simple to complex societies, but what if that's not the whole story? Imagine sophisticated societies flourishing thousands of years ago, leaving behind just these faint traces for us to piece together.
A giant puzzle just waiting to be solved. And to get started with this puzzle, we're going to have to look at a story that many are familiar with, the story of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. After the flood, they were tasked with repopulating the world, and there were specific prophecies tied to each son that shaped the destinies of their descendants.
Yeah, those prophecies weren't just stories. They really had a profound impact on how people saw themselves and the world around them, right? Shem's descendants were promised blessings, and they would continue to worship the one true God. But it's the prophecy about Ham's descendants that's particularly relevant to our deep dive today.
Right, the prophecy said that Ham's descendants would face servitude and obscurity. This idea has been used throughout history to justify, all sorts of power imbalances and the mistreatment of certain groups. It's a really dark side of history that we can't ignore.
Absolutely. And then you have Japheth, whose descendants were predicted to expand and become incredibly influential. It's interesting how this prophecy seems to foreshadow the rise of certain global powers over the centuries. But let's get back to the Hamites. Our sources suggest that they might have been responsible for a truly advanced civilization that's been overlooked in traditional historical narratives.
It's almost like they've been hidden in plain sight. And what makes this even more intriguing is the fact that we don't have many written records directly from the Hamites themselves. So we're left with this mystery, having to piece together their story from archaeology, language studies, ancient myths. It's like being a historical detective.
Exactly. And the evidence we do have points to them being incredible builders, like creating structures that still boggle the mind even today. Take the Burz Nimrod mound in Mesopotamia, for example. It's thought to be the site of the Tower of Babel and the Temple of Belus. What's fascinating is this structure was a 7-terrace pyramid, and this type of pyramid pops up again and again in ancient Hamitic architecture.
It's like a fingerprint, right? Hinting at their presence and their influence across different parts of the world. Our sources also talk about the amazing temples in Egypt, places like Thebes and Memphis, covered in these intricate carvings and hieroglyphics. And then there's the labyrinth that Herodotus described as having 3,000 chambers and a pyramid, all built by the Mizraimites, who were a branch of the Hamites who settled in Egypt. It's mind-blowing to think about the level of skill and organization they must have had.
Yeah, and their architectural achievements weren't limited to just Mesopotamia and Egypt. We see evidence of their presence in Arabia as well. Think about those colossal rock-cut structures like the vast court at Baalbek or the stadium at Petra. These places scream sophisticated engineering and a level of societal organization that was likely way ahead of its time.
I always thought of pyramids as mainly an Egyptian thing, but our sources suggest that they were building 7-storied pagodas that resemble the Burz Nimrod all the way in India and Cochin China, which makes you wonder if there was some kind of connection or even migration eastward. It really challenges our understanding of how these ancient civilizations might have interacted.
And it doesn't end there. We even see hints of a possible trans-Pacific connection. Some researchers point to the similarities between the pyramids and burial mounds found in Mexico and Central America with those in the East. It's a controversial theory for sure, but one that raises really fascinating questions about the possibility of contact or even migration across the Pacific Ocean thousands of years ago.
Wow. Imagine that a network of civilizations spanning the globe, all potentially connected by this unique architectural style. We might be talking about a shared knowledge and cultural practices that we haven't even begun to fully grasp.
It really flips the script on how we view ancient history, but to add another layer of complexity to this story, we need to talk about the Phoenicians. They were a branch of the Hamites known for their incredible seafaring skills and trading networks.
Oh yeah, they were like the masters of the Mediterranean, right?
Yeah.
I was reading that they weren't just content with staying in the Mediterranean either. Our sources describe Phoenician settlements popping up in Europe, North Africa. They were sailing as far as Madeira, the British Isles, and maybe even the New World. It seems their reach was vast, and their impact on trade and cultural exchange in the ancient world must have been immense.
Oh, absolutely. But their story also has a darker side. There's this stark contrast between their material wealth and their religious practices. The sources talk about the worship of Baal and Astarte, and even more disturbing, their practice of child sacrifice. It's a reminder that a civilization can achieve great things, but still engage in acts that are deeply troubling to us today.
It really makes you think about what truly defines the success or failure of a civilization, right? It's not just about advancements, it's about the moral and ethical foundations they built upon. And speaking of which, our sources don't shy away from the eventual decline of the Hamitic civilizations. What happened to them?
That's the question that's puzzled scholars for centuries. They were clearly innovative and powerful, yet their influence faded over time. Many theories link this decline to their religious practices and the oppressive nature of their rule.
So we have this fascinating mix of achievements and disturbing practices, and ultimately their power dwindled. How does this connect back to that prophecy about the Hamites facing servitude and obscurity?
Well, it's a complex puzzle with no easy answers, but you can't help but see the parallels right between their eventual decline and that ancient prediction. Despite their initial power, their legacy seems to have been overshadowed, leaving behind these scattered ruins and mentions in ancient texts.
It's almost like they achieved greatness, but ultimately faded from historical memory. It makes you wonder how much of our history is still out there waiting to be rediscovered. But for now, let's dive into another aspect of this story: the role of languages in understanding the Hamites and their connection to the Tower of Babel.
It's amazing when you think about it. When we talk about lost civilizations, we often get so focused on the physical stuff, like the ruins and the artifacts, but languages, they give us this whole other way to look into the past, like these living fossils carrying echoes of ancient cultures and how they saw the world.
It's so true. We often think of language as just a tool for communication, right? But it's so much more than that. It shapes how we think, how we understand everything around us. So how does language help us understand the story of the Hamites and this whole Tower of Babel thing?
Well, you remember the Tower of Babel story, right? Where everyone spoke the same language, and then as a consequence for their ambition, God made them speak different languages, scattering them all over the earth. Our sources suggest that we can look at this story through a modern lens using something called comparative philology.
Okay, I'm listening. Break that down for me. Comparative philology. It sounds kind of complicated.
Think of it like archaeology, but for languages. By studying the similarities and differences between languages, we can trace how they've evolved over time. We can even reconstruct ancient languages, getting us closer to what that original language spoken at the dawn of humanity might have sounded like.
So by tracing the roots of languages, we can uncover these connections between cultures and their shared origins. That's really cool. What does this linguistic archaeology tell us about the Tower of Babel story?
It's really fascinating because comparative philology actually supports this idea of a sudden diversification of languages. Just like the Babel story describes the Semitic and Japhetic language families, for example, they appear very suddenly in history, fully formed and distinct. It's as if they emerged from a single source and then rapidly branched out, creating this linguistic diversity we see today.
That's a pretty strong connection. Our sources emphasize that language isn't just about, practical communication. It actually reflects a culture's whole worldview, their way of thinking, their relationship with the universe. So by understanding the unique characteristics of languages, we might gain deeper insights into the people who spoke them.
Exactly. For example, Semitic languages, they often focus more on concrete things and spiritual realm. Their grammatical structures emphasize actions in relationships, which suggests a worldview where God is actively involved in human affairs. On the other hand, you have Japhetic languages, which tend towards abstraction and a focus on the material world. They're very good at expressing complex ideas and scientific concepts, which might help explain why the Japhetic branch has been so successful in developing science and technology.
It's like the structure of their languages paved the way for their advancements in those areas. But that doesn't mean one language family is better than another, right? They just represent different ways of understanding and interacting with the world. But let's get back to the Hamite days. We've talked about their incredible buildings. But if their civilization was so advanced, shouldn't we have found more written records from them? Where are their libraries or inscriptions?
That's the million-dollar question. There are a few possible explanations. One is that their writing system could be so different from what we're used to that we haven't figured it out yet. It might be so unique that we haven't cracked the code. Or maybe their records were just lost to time, fires, floods, wars, all the things that can destroy fragile documents.
Or maybe they just didn't prioritize written records as much as other civilizations did. Remember, their architectural achievements suggest a culture that was really focused on tangible things, on creating these monumental structures. Perhaps their knowledge was passed down through oral traditions or practical demonstrations rather than written texts. It's interesting to think about how different cultures might have valued different ways of transmitting knowledge.
Absolutely, but the lack of written records definitely makes our job as historical detectives a lot harder. It forces us to rely on other types of evidence, like the structures they left behind, the tools they used, and the stories passed down through generations. It's like trying to put together a giant jigsaw puzzle with half the pieces missing.
Speaking of missing pieces, our sources point out something really intriguing: the potential connection between the Hamites and ancient civilizations in the Americas. I have to admit, when I first read about this trans-Pacific migration theory, I was a little skeptical. It sounds almost too far-fetched, but the more I learn, the more I'm starting to wonder.
It is a bold theory, but it's gaining traction as we uncover more evidence. Remember those architectural similarities we talked about earlier? Well, some researchers believe those parallels are just too similar to be a coincidence. They suggest that the Hamites, with their mastery of seafaring, might have actually ventured across the Pacific Ocean thousands of years ago, bringing their knowledge and culture to the New World.
Wow, that would completely change our understanding of history. It would mean that the Hamites played a much bigger role in shaping global civilizations than we ever imagined. What kind of evidence besides the architecture supports this theory?
Well, the sources highlight some fascinating similarities between religious practices and myths found in the Americas and those from regions associated with the Hamites. For instance, the prevalence of serpent imagery in both cultures is pretty striking. And then there's the disturbing practice of human sacrifice, which was found in both Hamitic and ancient American cultures. It's as if there's this invisible thread connecting these seemingly separate worlds, a thread that stretches across vast oceans and spans millennia.
Of course, more research is needed to confirm or refute this theory, but even the possibility opens up entirely new perspectives on human history. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions about how connected ancient societies might have been and the potential for cultural exchange across these vast distances. It's almost like we're getting a glimpse into a lost world, but we can't forget that the biblical prophecy about the Hamites wasn't exactly a positive one. They were predicted to face servitude and obscurity. How does this prophecy align with their potential achievements and worldwide influence?
It is a paradox, isn't it? On one hand, we see evidence of this highly advanced civilization with a potentially global reach. On the other hand, we have this prophecy of decline and this lack of lasting recognition. It's a puzzle that has fascinated and frustrated scholars for centuries. Maybe the prophecy wasn't about a literal enslavement, but rather a loss of their distinct cultural identity, a fading from historical memory, despite their achievements.
So their knowledge and influence might have been absorbed by other cultures, their contributions overshadowed by later civilizations. It's kind of like a river flowing into the ocean. The water is still there, but becomes part of something larger. Its original source, less distinct.
Exactly. Their legacy might live on in the foundations of later civilizations woven into the fabric of human history, even if we don't always recognize it. It's a reminder that history is rarely a simple, straightforward story. It's full of complexities, contradictions, and layers upon layers of influence.
It's like trying to untangle a giant knot, but every time you loosen one strand, you discover another connection, another story waiting to be told. We spent quite a bit of time on the Hamites, but let's shift our focus now to the other branch of Noah's descendants. The Japhethites, according to the prophecy, they were destined for expansion and influence. Their story is just as fascinating, filled with incredible achievements, but also some dark chapters. All right, so we spent quite a bit of time exploring the world of the Hamites, their rise and fall, their incredible achievements, and that eventual fading from historical memory. But now let's turn our attention to the Japhethites. Remember, according to the prophecy, they were destined for expansion and influence, and their story really does take us across the globe. It's an incredible journey.
Yeah, it really is. The Japhethite story is one of remarkable resilience and adaptation. You think about early Europe, and it was a completely different world back then, a much harsher environment full of dangers like mammoths and cave lions, even saber-toothed tigers.
Wow. I can't even imagine trying to survive in a world like that. It sounds terrifying, like something out of a movie. And our sources talk about the challenges they faced, not just from the environment, but from other human groups already living in Europe.
Exactly. They had to compete for resources and navigate these complex social dynamics with groups who were already well established in those territories. It was a time of intense struggle and adaptation, a real test of their survival skills.
It makes you wonder how they managed to not only survive, but eventually thrive in such a demanding setting. What was their secret?
Well, the sources suggest that these challenges actually played a key role in shaping their character and paving the way for their later achievements. They had to be resourceful, innovative, and deeply connected to the natural world to survive.
They had to learn to work with nature, not just against it, right? They mastered fire, created tools from stone, and bone-honed their skills as hunters and gatherers.
Exactly. It was a period of slow and steady progress, driven by necessity and this determination to not just survive, but to build a future for themselves. And you can see this in how they began to transform the landscape of Europe, gradually clearing forests, establishing settlements, and developing their own unique culture.
It's interesting to contrast their approach with that of the Hamites, right? The Hamites seem to focus on these grand architectural projects and the accumulation of material wealth, but the Japhethites took a different path.
Yeah, their focus shifted towards understanding the underlying principles of nature. They were driven by observation, experimentation, and the development of abstract thought. It was during this period that the seeds of scientific inquiry were sown, laying the groundwork for their future achievements in fields like astronomy, physics, mathematics, and engineering.
So instead of just trying to conquer nature, they were trying to understand it and use that knowledge to their advantage.
Precisely. But it's important to remember that this shift towards a more scientific worldview wasn't something that happened overnight or in isolation. The sources emphasize the role of cultural exchange, particularly the influence of Semitic ideas and beliefs.
Oh, right. The prophecy did mention that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem. So as the Japhethites expanded their territories, they interacted more with Semitic cultures.
Exactly. And through these interactions, they started to absorb and adapt certain aspects of Semitic thought, particularly in areas like religion and ethics. This fusion of ideas, this blending of different perspectives, seems to have played a crucial role in shaping their worldview and their path to advancement.
It's like they took the best of both worlds, combining the practical, nature-focused knowledge of their own heritage with the spiritual and ethical insights from the Semitic cultures they encountered.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And we can see this reflected in the evolution of their languages, too. Remember how we talked about the abstract and adaptable nature of Japhetic languages? Well, this linguistic flexibility seems to have been key in their ability to develop these complex systems of thought, to articulate scientific concepts, and to build upon the knowledge accumulated by previous generations.
So their language was almost like a tool that helped them advance in science and technology.
In a way, yes, it allowed them to express and share their ideas in increasingly sophisticated ways, facilitating their progress and setting the stage for their eventual expansion across the globe. And their reach did extend far beyond Europe, driven by this insatiable curiosity and a drive to explore new horizons.
They were pushing boundaries in more ways than one. Our sources describe their ventures eastward into Asia, establishing trade routes, founding cities, interacting with all sorts of diverse cultures, and of course we can't forget about their expansion westward across the Atlantic to the Americas. This westward journey ultimately led to the rise of those dominant global powers we see today.
It's a complex story, one of exploration, colonization, the spread of ideas and technologies on a scale never seen before, but it's also a story of conflict and conquest, of the displacement and subjugation of indigenous populations.
It's a reminder that progress and power often come at a cost, and it raises some really tough questions about the ethical implications of expansion and the responsibilities that come with influence.
Absolutely. It challenges us to examine the darker side of human history and to acknowledge the injustices that were inflicted in the name of progress. But despite these shadows, the Japhethite story is also one of truly remarkable achievements, breakthroughs in science and technology that have transformed our understanding of the universe and our place within it.
Think about those revolutionary ideas of Copernicus and Galileo, who challenged that long-held belief that the Earth was the center of the universe, or the groundbreaking work of Sir Isaac Newton, who unveiled the laws of gravity and motion, laying the foundation for modern physics.
These were all Japhethite minds, driven by that same insatiable curiosity and relentless pursuit of knowledge that's characterized their branch of humanity, and their legacy continues to shape our world today. The technologies we rely on, the scientific advancements that push the boundaries of human understanding, they all have their roots in the intellectual foundations laid by the Japhethites.
It's incredible to think about the lasting impact they've had on our world. So where does all of this leave us? We've explored the rise and fall of the Hamites, their incredible achievements, and their eventual fading from historical memory, and we've traced this remarkable journey of the Japhethites, from their challenging beginnings in a harsh environment to their rise to global prominence.
It's been quite a journey through time, uncovering these layers of human history filled with both triumphs and tragedies. What's clear is that the destinies of these two branches of humanity have been intertwined from the very beginning, shaping the course of civilization in profound and often unpredictable ways.
And it really makes you wonder, what does the future hold for these two branches of humanity? Will the Japhethites continue their dominance, or will new powers emerge to challenge their influence? Will the Hamites' legacy be fully rediscovered, their contributions to human history finally acknowledged? These are questions we can ponder as we continue to explore the mysteries of the past and the possibilities of the future. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning, and to keep diving deeper into the stories that have shaped our world. Because the more we understand our past, the better equipped we are to navigate the present and build a future worthy of our shared human heritage. Until next time.